Welcome to Trade and Tariff Tuesdays. We're back with another edition of Avalara's webinar series discussing the Trump administration's tariffs and their impacts on trade compliance. We started this weekly series back in February, so if you have joined us before, welcome back. If it's your first time, welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Regina and I will be your host. Before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping items. A friendly reminder that Avalara cannot provide legal or tax advice. On your screen is our safe harbor policy. Please take a moment to review. We're recording today's event and you'll receive the recording later today. The console you're looking at can be customized. Feel free to move or resize the windows. The additional resources section contains a lot of great related resources, including the slide deck. There are several ways to engage with presenters and attendees today. First, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Ask a Question box. We'll save time at the end for Q&A and may also pepper them in throughout the presentation. You can also submit troubleshooting questions in that Q&A box. Second, you can join our attendee chat. Click the icon at the bottom of your screen with the two chat bubbles and the attendee chat will appear. We encourage you to introduce yourself, network, and discuss today's topic. Third, you can react to the presentation by clicking on the emoji icon. And then last, since today's session is less than an hour and intended to be interactive and responsive, it is not eligible for CPE credit. Avalara's Customer Conference Crush is on tour with locations coming up in Atlanta and Dallas, so check that out at events.avalara.com for details. Let's meet today's presenters from Avalara. We have Craig Reed, General Manager of Cross Border, and Shane Bogdan, Director of Sales Cross Border. That's all I have for housekeeping today, so I'll hand it over to Craig to get us started with the presentation.
Thanks, Regina. Welcome back, Shane. We've got the two of us on today. Our friend Patrick's on vacation, as I'm sure a lot of other people are, as we kind of enter the dog days of summer here. And, well, the dog days of summer has an important date in it, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But let's just talk about the agenda here. So as we always do, for those of you returning, we're going to go through the latest news, kind of summarize where we stand right now. You know, there's been developments. It's been a little quieter, I think, than normal, but still, you know, lots to talk about, obviously. Some of the implications to your business, we got some interesting new stats to talk about that I think you'll find interesting, and how you can take action with Avalara. And as always, we are going to try to pepper Q&A throughout the talk if we kind of see things that are relevant to what we're talking about. Nancy said orange must be the company color, but it looks like a prison jumpsuit on these calls. That's pretty funny. It's also the national color for the Netherlands, right? So it's when we were wearing these in the Netherlands, it was quite popular. But that is pretty funny. Thanks, Nancy. As we always do, let's do a poll question first. So what is the latest proposed tariff rate announced for Canada, which President Trump announced on Truth Social and then on a letter would take place on August 1st? Is it 25, 30, 35, or 50%? That's an easy one for me to answer because I live in Canada, so we get a lot of news about that up here. But just give you a second to answer that. Oh, I did it too quickly, I think. Nobody answered. The correct answer is 35%. So that is what is proposed to go into effect. But we're going to talk a bit about what that really means, because there's been some interesting stats that have come out recently about Canadian exports to the U.S. and trade. So we're going to talk about that. But let's get into the latest news on trade and tariffs. So the July 9th deadline, that was sort of the big date that everyone was waiting for, turned out to be a bit of a nothing burger, you know, because of the extension to August 1st. So, and subsequent to that, a bunch of countries received letters saying what their tariffs rates were going to be, taking effect on August 1st, unless those trade agreements were reached. So currently right now, all the reciprocal tariffs are still in place. So the 10%, except on Mexico, Canada, and China. The IEEPA and Section 232 tariffs are unchanged, so that doesn't modify any of that. Applies to Canada, Mexico, and China. And the 232 tariffs for steel, aluminum, copper, et cetera, haven't been modified. It also brought in this new retaliation clause where President Trump said, "Hey, if you do anything in retaliation, we're gonna raise it just by the same amount." Similar to what happened with China, where there was that escalation. Copper and pharmaceuticals. So big news there was the 50% on copper. So, I don't know how much research you've done on it, but copper is in a lot of things. So that'll be interesting to see what happens there. And that's going to be August 1st as well. And then the 200% on pharmaceuticals, it looks like there's going to be a grace period of about 1.5 years for that. So during this period from July 9th to where we are today, the 22nd, there's been tariff letters sent to 14 countries, including, Japan, South Korea. The range has been from 25 to 40%. We'll talk a bit about where everybody landed there. And 11 more countries got tariff letters after July 9th, including Canada, Mexico, and the EU. There was also this transshipment clause in addition to the retaliation clause where goods that are transshipped through countries are going to be subject to higher tariffs, meaning, if it's made in China, goes through Vietnam, they're really watching for that. And again, we're going to talk about that a bit more, but transshipment and retaliation were kind of some of the new things, along with, there's, even though all these tariffs have changed, nothing's really changed with 232 or 301, have they changed?
No, nothing at all about those pieces. And I think if everybody remembers, I think maybe probably in another session we'll bring it up, but just as a reminder of what the differences are between IEEPA 232 and 301s, how the 232s and 301s are more industry-specific tariff mechanisms, more along the lines of national security and also kind of protecting from certain manufacturing sectors.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me go through here because I think we'll probably roundtable this one to a little bit of a degree because Canada. So some interesting things here. I mean, I think everybody, after the first poll question, everybody knows that the proposed tariff rate on August 1st for Canada is going to be this 35% as part of this IEEPA tariff. There was still this whole unclear piece about USMCA being, for qualifying goods, would they still be exempt or not? Interesting fact that, Craig pulled up earlier today. And Craig, what was it around? Previously we had always been voicing that 34% of goods coming into the US from Canada were designated USMCA eligible. So they would be free essentially.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
Now what it's saying now is that because of these tariffs that have been in play, it's actually accelerating these goods getting USMCA certified. So now it's close to 2/3 of these with what I'm projecting now to hit 90% of qualifying goods by the end of this year.
That's the news I just read is that, it's not that the goods that were, and the stat was, as Shane said, 40% of goods coming from Canada were USMCA, but that didn't mean that the other 60% were not USMCA eligible. So what's really interesting is the reason that a lot of Canadian companies never applied for USMCA certification is because the tariffs, the non-USMCA tariffs were so low. But now that they've gone up to 25 and soon to be 30%, everyone has a heavy incentive to get USMCA certified. So that's jumped up to 66% now and is some analysts are saying it's going to go up to 90%. So that's really interesting because Canada was at 40, Mexico was at 50. And it'll be interesting to see if the same pattern happens in Mexico, where a lot of Mexican firms are jumping to get USMCA compliant.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume so, that people are going to start seeing what Canada is doing, and also how do you get the lowest rate and get it most effective, importing into the U.S. But yeah, so switching over to Mexico, Mexico is slated for a 30% tariff starting August 1st. The European Union was the next one in the crosshairs here, which is 30%. But some interesting pieces on the EU. I mean, they've started voicing some retaliatory measures. Nothing public, nothing set in stone here. But some things I read earlier today was that they are looking potentially to leverage anti-coercion instruments basically, and I'll just read this off, legal tools that allow the EU to impose new taxes on U.S. tech companies, reduce investments in U.S. firms on EU soil, and potentially prevent U.S. companies from bidding on public European contracts. And on top of that, that's on in addition to potentially $100 billion worth of U.S. goods targeted at red states. So the EU's going about it a little bit differently here, already starting to talk about retaliation methods. Now, I know there's still negotiations are in play, but I think this is one of the first ones since Canada and China where we're really starting to see a stronger presence in terms of retaliation on that piece.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there's a retaliation on the retaliation. That's Trump.
Exactly. You got it. Yeah. And then Brazil, they received a letter for 50% tariff on Brazilian imports effective August 1st. For a lot of you don't know, if you're in the U.S., I started diving down this Brazil hole, and a majority of orange juice imported in the U.S. comes from Brazil. The other piece here is beef, and there's now big concerns that beef prices are going to raise substantially because Brazil is the #1 importer of beef into the U.S. So some interesting things that we got to start thinking about from a day-to-day perspective that are on our kitchen tables. And then updates on base tariffs across all of the other countries. Last week, after our last trade-in tariff, Trump came out and said outside of the top 30 countries, they're looking at it's going to either be a 10 or 15% tariff. So either maintaining that current 10% that's in play right now for these markets or raising that additional 5% to 15%. So more to come here. Again, that's not official, but that was just over a press conference that was taking place on that piece. But to keep up with all of this, we always want to point folks to our blogs. We are keeping everything updated in terms of the tariff letters, what countries are getting reciprocal tariffs, et cetera. You can see the current list here. Anything in dark blue has an increased proposed tariff on August 1st from the original April 2nd date. Yellow, no change, and light blue is decreased from April 2nd. I think the only one from last week where there's been some sort of change has been around Indonesia there, reduced to 19% pending, kind of a joint statement here. So it's still in the air, but they were the latest one. The only other country, I think, since last week that was in the news in terms of potentially cutting some sort of deal with the U.S. on this piece. So we'll go to our where are we now, Craig?
Yeah, sure. So China again. So we've got 30% IEEPA tariffs. So that's the 301, or pardon me, the 232s. So 30% on the majority of those imports, 20% plus 10% baseline. And the 301s remain fully in force and effect, meaning that, there's a long list of Section 301 tariffs that would be stacked on top of that. So it's 30% plus. Also, the end of de minimis on May 2nd for China and Hong Kong. We'll talk about that in a second. And there are some exclusions, though, for 301s that, and this is why it's really important. We'll get to this in a bit, why it's really important that you know your HS codes, because these are all based on the codes and the types of products that are shipped. So that's where China sits, roughly 55% when you add things up on average. Canada and Mexico. So Canada, as we talked about earlier, is at 35%. Mexico at 30%. It's we're saying here on the slide, it's unclear if USMCA compliant goods will continue to get 0%. That has been, I think, mostly clarified that they will continue to see the 0% tariffs, and the energy products will see the 10% tariffs. And there's actually a question in the box here from Billy, a Canadian company that sells to the U.S. regularly, purchases supplies for the U.S. monthly to make their products. How do we apply for USMCA certification? That's a great question. There's actually I think both the Canadian, I'm not sure about Mexico, I know Canada and the U.S. have on their government websites details for how to qualify for USMCA. And actually, maybe Shane, next time we can, because it's so important, maybe next time we can go through that in a little more detail and we can give folks more information on USMCA. So great question, Billy. And we'll, don't have anything prepared here, but I do know that if you go and look up USMCA on the Canadian government website, there's a fair amount of information, but we'll try to distill that for you next time around. For the other major trading partners, as Shane said, we're at 10%, and it could increase to 15% if deals aren't reached by August 1st. That's for the basket of countries that haven't been named in the specific tariff letters. The UK has really kind of come out of this the best out of everyone, really. 10% are still in place. 25% on steel and aluminum are reduced to 10% for them, and 10% for the first 100,000 vehicles annually. So they really came out of this smelling like roses. The EU is 30%. That's paused until August 1st. And then, as Shane mentioned, Indonesia went down to 19%, although there are some news reports that they weren't aware of that. And then we've still got the 25% on countries that buy oil and gas from Venezuela. We've got the 50%, except for the UK, on steel and aluminum, 25% on autos, and 50% on copper coming. So that's sort of where everything stands today. And then the other big piece of news, certainly for the e-commerce industry, is the removal of de minimis. And for those of you who don't know, previously anything that was shipped to the US under $800 came in duty free. So that was removed for products from China and Hong Kong. So now anything that comes in from China and Hong Kong is subject to applicable duties. If it's not postal, it's just whatever the duties are. So it would be the IEPA 30% plus the underlying tariff. And for postal shipments, it's 54% of the value of the good, or $100 per package. And then the other interesting things are reporting requirements. So, it used to come in, there wasn't a lot of reporting requirements for under de minimis products. Now there are. So you have to know your HS codes, you have to know your countries of origin, you have to be accurate on your value for duty, et cetera. And the other thing that's interesting is that, in a bipartisan move, in the One Big Beautiful Bill, they're saying July 1st, 2027 for a change where it's everyone. De minimis goes away for everybody, which Shane, that was a pretty interesting one, right? And we've heard a little bit rumblings in the industry that it could happen even sooner than that.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to go back to this in a second, but if you are an international retailer right now, or anybody international that is primarily shipped to the US under de minimis, under that $800 and not from China at the moment, I would start really thinking about ways in which to prepare for this, understanding country of origin, understanding what the potential duty rates are, et cetera, especially as we go into holiday season. We're going to show you how we can help on that in a minute, but this is going to be critical going into holiday. If you are an international seller, and US being a primary market of yours, how do you start illustrating what potential duties are and having that information? So more to come, later slides in this, some new ones that we have. But, just in relation to the future of de minimis, I mean, obviously, China, Hong Kong are out right now. We are hearing rumblings that a majority of other countries may be dropped sooner than that 2027 date. I think we all know we've always been talking about country of origin. We threw that list up earlier on which countries are being impacted by the tariffs. Those are all based upon country of origin right there. So they want to ensure that that those goods are coming from the applicable countries. And in fact, country of origin, what was the latest case this past week, Craig, that a seller out of China who's selling bed springs, they falsely put on their country of origin declaration they were sending them out of Thailand to get preferential duties. Well, the CBP just slapped them with over $300 million in fines. So again, hopefully you've all heard it here first from us of make sure you have the appropriate country of origin and do not try to skirt these loopholes, because CBP is after it. They are trying to set example, and they also want to collect on that revenue. So obviously it goes into these stronger enforcement mechanisms. And then there's new PGA filing exemption changes. Previously, these things, you did not need to include additional certifications on these pieces. The PGA is now, the FDA, EPA, USDA, et cetera, they are now including that there's filing exempt changes on here. So one thing, just so you know, from Avalara, we actually provide tariff and trade content for goods that are coming to the U.S. that illustrate which goods have specific PGA flags and which corresponding departments. So just keep that in mind. We can help out on that front. Let's go through here. So implications to your business. So Craig, you want to take the 4 horsemen here?
Yeah, we call it the 4 horsemen. It's, the 4 standards of global trade, the things that you need to know. We talked about de minimis exemptions. Every country around the world has a different de minimis. So if you're shipping to other countries other than, coming in the US, which we talk a lot about, but every other country has a de minimis. So you need to know at what level you start getting charged duties and taxes. The country of origin is crucially important, as we're going to talk about in a second. In fact, country of origin has become obviously one of the biggest discussion points out there, because that's really what triggers the duty rates. And that, and combined with tariff code classification. So tariff codes are in the industry also known as HS codes. This is really, to me, the Rosetta Stone of global commerce. That it's what every country requires you to tell them what good you're importing, and it's based on a code. And countries are common up to 6 digits, but every country adds between 3 and 6 more digits, typically 4, so you get a 10-digit code. And if you think about a table, like an Excel spreadsheet, the rows would be the tariff codes or the HS codes, and the columns would be the countries of origin. And the intersection of those 2 things is your duty rate. So that's why those 2 things are crucially important. And then your declared value has to be accurate as well. You can't misdeclare value. So, you take your Excel table, you take your tariff code, your country of origin, you get your percentage against your declared value above your de minimis. That's your duty. That's how you end up paying duty. And that's why it's so important that you know all these things and that they're accurate, because as we show in the next slide, where your country of origin is really you're really responsible for it. So, and we get this all the time. In fact, we get questions constantly where folks are still confusing point of origin from country of origin. So where the product shipped from or where it's located is not the country of origin. The country of origin is where the majority of the value of the product was added or it was transformed. There's specific rules around it. So make sure you know your country of origin. As Shane mentioned, there's that $3.4 million penalty against Race and Global. That was for the mattress springs. They were trying to avoid duties. Wow, 234% versus 6%, pretty heavy incentive to try to figure out how to avoid that, but boy, they're going to pay for it. So remember, you're really responsible. And the CBP on their LinkedIn page, they say this all the time. They're really becoming vigilant on on country of origin. And if you're the importer, you're responsible. So, it could be steep fines, it could be seizure, business disruption, loss of import privileges, criminal charges, or some combination of those things, which obviously are going to disrupt your business pretty significantly. So don't mess around with country of origin. All right, some trade statistics, Shane.
Yeah, as part of the whole piece here as it relates to CBP and enforcement, these are some pretty astounding numbers. So year to date, the U.S. CBP has collected close to $109 billion worth of duties, taxes, and fees since January at the beginning of the year. To put it in perspective, last year, 2024 alone, the U.S. collected, from a full year standpoint, $88 billion. So we're well beyond what the full year number was in 24. And some interesting things here, because, these are $58 billion of this is coming from these IEEPA tariffs and also the Section 232 tariffs on automobiles. And ironically enough, to the past 48 hours, there's been some interesting earnings reports on some automakers here. I'm going to quick roll out some stats. So Stellantis, their earnings announced yesterday. They announced that they're expected to get hit. Their last earnings, they did get hit with $350 million from the impact of tariffs. And as everybody knows, that we've been, talking about on these webinars is that there's a 25% tariff on imported cars that took place back in April. Well, ironically enough, the shipments to North America declined for them by 25% in Q2 versus last year. And they're now stating on the earnings calls that they need to raise car prices soon. And basically that quote unquote tariffs are inherently inflationary. So there's Stellantis, $350 million, 25% drop in Q2. Now they're talking about raising prices. 3 hours ago, GM just announced their earnings. They are now basically stating a $4 billion to $5 billion impact to their bottom line due to tariffs. Now, this was just announced. So, I mean, these are major, major car brands here that are now coming out strong on these pieces in terms of how they're going to be impacted. But clearly, Section 232 on automobiles, that revenue is then going into, those funds are now going into that number. So pretty interesting.
Yeah. When
we go into this chart, we're basically talking about, the trade deficit and what's happening versus imports versus exports. So we're always talking about timelines since the beginning of February. And what you can see here is this large spike. The blue line and orange line was in relation to the deficit, which is basically stating the importing versus we're importing more versus exporting. And really that big spike right there was due to all of the front loading that was taking place in that April, May timeframe before some of these additional these Liberation Day announcements then were put on pause. So you're seeing a lot of front loading, but ironically enough, now we're seeing a decline in terms of the imports. I just read a stat that May was U.S. apparel imports from China fell to a 22-year low in May, which is pretty wild on that piece. So again, more and more of these stats are coming out, but this is very interesting to see how businesses were really front loading at that first Q1, beginning of Q2 part of this year, and now that's kind of trailed off on those pieces.
Yeah.
And then holiday season. So we're going to go into a couple slides here, as we start thinking about peak. I ran some numbers earlier. It's 129 days until Black Friday, which is crazy. So we're getting close to under 130 days to Black Friday. But I think what we want to show here is really the trend year over year, that e-commerce continues to be a driving force and for holiday, and that year over year, obviously we're taking 2020 out of these perspectives here, that it continues to rise year over year on these pieces. So 241 billion in 2024 for U.S. holiday sales. Again, this is just showing the emphasis on where consumers want to be on these pieces and how you need to start getting actively prepared now in order to continue to take advantage of this channel. So, Craig, maybe some steps to walk us through to prepare here that really align with our previous talk tracks.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of going back to the four horsemen, make sure you've got everything right. So your HS codes are correct. Your country of origin is correct. What your de minimis is. We can help you with all those things. We'll talk about that in a second. So, you can also look at diversifying your supply chain. So can you nearshore? Can you localize? Can you make sure you have multiple sources as these tariffs sort of roll out? There's still going to be uncertainty, I think, because even August 1st isn't really certain. You can make different changes to your pricing model and promotional strategies to build in margin buffers or upsells. You can do early shipping. You can build inventory and fulfillment hubs to try to buffer things. And then finally, which we're going to talk about a bit more, try to enhance your customer experience. So, we're huge advocates of DDP shipping with landed cost. We're going to talk about that in a second here. So really giving your buyers transparent price messaging is really become an expectation as international shoppers have become more sophisticated. So those are a few things you can do. Why don't we talk a bit more about landed cost, Shane?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to answer, Aaron's question here just before we dive into it, because I was responding back to it. They mentioned here, country of origin is China. We have 30%, whatever, plus whatever 301 is until August. After that, do we know what the new tariff will be for China? No, we don't know. And basically, the only thing that we do know is that a few weeks ago, or now it's now a month or so ago now, there was, the talks in London with U.S. and the Chinese representatives, and out of that, there was a stated framework basically stating that the U.S. would impose 55% tariffs on Chinese goods, and then China 10% on U.S. goods. There has been no further talk since then, and I know a lot of this has all been around the chips and magnets pieces that U.S. obviously needs magnets to create a lot of our electronics, cars, etc., whereas China is in the search for the U.S. chips, etc. Outside of that, I don't think there's been any additional discussions around percentages on what's going to happen on August 1st for China, unless you don't know anything different. Correct?
The only other thing I had heard is that they had opened the door that 20% of that 30 was the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs, right?
Yep.
So if they felt comfortable, quote unquote, with what China was doing with fentanyl to prevent fentanyl from coming in the country, they may remove the IEEPA tariffs. The same applied to Canada. So whether or not that fentanyl piece comes off, we don't know. But that was sort of a door that was opened as well.
Yeah. And sorry, that might have been pronounced Aaron. I think I said Aaron. So yeah, landed costs, what Craig's been talking about. And this is why we were all kind of mentioning this whole piece. If you are selling it currently, if you are, selling goods from other non-US markets right now and that are not China or Hong Kong, the de minimis currently right now is, $800. So these goods coming in are not going to be assessed duties. What we are continuing to hear is that de minimis is most likely going to go away potentially by the end of this year for other countries importing into the US. Why is this important? Because put yourself in the consumer shoes. When you go to a web page and you are checking out, you want to understand the full cost of what you are purchasing there. You want to understand the product costs, what additional taxes or tariffs are on those. You want to understand that whole piece. And that's really what a landed cost is. It's the product costs, duties, taxes, tariffs, insurance, any sort of shipping as a whole, and any sort of additional fees. Now, through Avalara, we can help on those first three pieces if you're already an Avalara client. We already know what the product cost is because you're uploading your catalog. We're already providing calculations on customs duties and tariffs, and as well as those taxes here. But where this really hits home is from a consumer standpoint about the whole DDP, so delivery duty paid or duty at place, also called delivery duty unpaid. Again, put yourself in the consumer shoes. You're purchasing something online. What's the last thing you want to do? Is a good gets to your door that you've ordered, you're excited about, and somebody from DHL or another carrier says, hey, you actually owe an additional $22.50 for this good. Or, hey, we're not releasing your parcel until you come down to the post and you pay these additional pieces. So by the ability to ship delivery duty unpaid is showing that fully landed cost quote, providing the duties, taxes, and tariffs upfront to the international consumer versus delivery duty unpaid, where you're actually not showing these things. And this is a core competency of Avalara, where we're being able to calculate and provide those duties, taxes, and tariffs at real time. So you can show those to the consumer. You can enable a DDP shipping solution to make this a best experience for that consumer. And I will say there's a lot of facts behind this. The number one driving force for cart abandonment is not providing duties, taxes, and tariffs at checkout, not providing transparent pricing, and not offering a DDP shipping option. You can provide both shipping options, that's absolutely fine, but more than likely the consumer is going to want to see all those goods up front. And like I said, just put yourself in those perspectives. Craig, what's the last thing you want is that you're excited about something coming through and then you get hit up at the door for, a couple bucks that you were not prepared. You would have looked at a different assortment from another retailer or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is key here, especially if de minimis changes. You're going to want to understand what are those duties going to calculate to for your U.S. consumers if these things changes, and also just getting prepared for any sort of other shipments to other markets as well, because duty rates fluctuates on those, which we also calculate. But more things to consider as we're thinking about it. Obviously, buy now, pay later. We've been talking about this, scrutiny in terms of cash flow coming in. you're going to want to start thinking about additional buy now, pay later methods if you don't already have them. How does that, how do we eliminate some of these tariff challenges here if we're still able to collect from the consumer? It allows them to basically be flexible with their wallet, and obviously, agility and visibility. Combine that planning with flexible supply chains that Craig was mentioning, automated compliance tools, calculating duties and taxes at checkout, DDP services. These are more things to make sure that you're considering here. And, how businesses are actively preparing for this. So Levi basically said the other day that they're reducing the amount of holiday SKUs and focusing on just really their highest performing SKUs, cutting inventory for any sort of complexity across the board on tariffs with these other complex SKUs. Mattel and Hasbro, Mattel's been a huge voice since February once the scrutiny on China was coming through, because the majority of Mattel's toys are imported from China, but now they're going to try to reduce their exposure down to about 10% by 2027. And Hallmark's now stating that they're going to start raising prices on goods and also moving these things from Thailand, Sri Lanka, et cetera. So already, if you haven't been thinking about holiday readiness, make sure you start thinking about it now with 129 days left. So, Craig, what are our normal polls here?
Yeah, we like to do these poll questions just to kind of track what's happening in the industry and what folks are thinking. So are you planning to adjust your supply chain due to these changes? So are you diversifying your suppliers and manufacturers, switching to local, investing in new trade technology or tools like ours, for example, rethinking your distribution strategies, or other things that we don't have listed here or you don't know yet? So, and you can select multiple things here. So I think I was a little quick on the gun last time, so we'll give folks a couple more seconds to answer this time. But it is interesting how, there's been so much uncertainty in the market. Is really interesting whether, to us for sure, whether things are starting to, solidify and folks are starting to make decisions, even though there's still a lot of uncertainty in the market. So let's get there. Yeah, this actually, I don't know yet. It's always been really high, but a little bit higher, I think, in diversification of suppliers and manufacturers, switching to local and rethinking distribution strategies. So that is interesting. I think, we're probably getting to a point where folks are going to have to start making some decisions, right, on how they're going to manage their supply chains. And then similarly, from a tariff perspective, what are your plans for addressing the increased costs from the tariffs? We brought up some examples of what different companies are doing. Are you going to pass on the costs? Are you going to include a tariff surcharge? Are you going to absorb it? Are you going to share the tariff costs with your suppliers? Or are you going to do a combination? You can select multiple here, or some other strategy we haven't thought of. So again, you can tell us multiple things you're doing, and we are kind of tracking these things as well. So we kind of watch the patterns here. While we're just waiting for folks to answer, Scott asked, which company was just fined for country of origin violations? It was
Racing Global.
Racing Global. Yeah, thank you. All right, let's see what folks said. Wow, look at that. So that, I think, is the highest we've ever seen for passing additional costs on to the customer and including a tariff surcharge. So 34% are saying absorb the tariff. So it looks like there's some combination going on here of, trying to share with suppliers, trying to absorb some, but hey, can't take it all. We're going to have to pass them on to the customer, which likely means that we have some inflation headed our way.
Yeah, and hey, if they're with Stellantis just saying this, yesterday, that tariffs are inflationary, they're going to start raising prices. These businesses are going to start being public about these costs, where they're putting them.
Yeah, and I don't think the White House is going to like that one bit.
No.
So how can businesses keep up with these changes, Shane?
Yeah, listen, unfortunately, the moral of the story here is that you want to reduce any sort of penalties, fines, and non-compliance that we talked about with CBP being all over these pieces. You don't want to be undercharging, overcharging customs duties upon import, et cetera. This goes back to what we were just talking about on even just duty calculations for your consumers coming in. And I will say, I'll tie this with Randy here. They said, will de minimis exist for finished goods coming in from Italy We manufacture in Italy with customers in the US. Yes, absolutely. So basically think of it of any goods that do not have a country of origin of the United States. There is heavy conversation, several bills still in the House that are bipartisan, wanting to remove de minimis for all other markets outside of just China and Hong Kong. Number 3 here is added costs to customers and supply chains. Obviously, you all just took a poll right here. What are you going to start doing in terms of these added costs? How does this impact your customers and supply chain? So again, folks need to start making some ideas and educated movements in terms of being proactive versus reactive on these things. And again, we can talk about on how we really can help out on here. I mean, from a calculation standpoint, the ability to understand what are the current duty rates for your goods. Currently, these are also ever changing, where we have a team of 200 content experts that are making sure that our duty rates on goods anywhere to everywhere are updated as quickly as possible. Our tariff code classifications, I mean, this is one of the 4 horsemen that we spoke about, but you also need country of origin as part of those pieces. You need the Rosetta Stone on all of your goods in order to determine these duty rates. Are there flags for these? Are there PGAs for these? This is more critical than ever, especially with import documents now requiring these details. The trade restrictions and content management, again, going back to, can something ship? Is there a flag on this good that it needs to go through further processing through PGAs, because of FDA components, et cetera? These are all the things we can help out on this front for you to be more proactive than reactive on these pieces. So I know we have 3 minutes here. Do we want to go through the demo, Craig, or?
Yeah, you know what? I think we're going to try to get to some questions because there's a couple of good ones in here. So we're going to, I'll skip ahead to, Shane went through some of the things we do. You know, we work with some of the largest marketplaces in the world, manufacturers, retailers, supply chain companies, carriers, brokers. So, you know, we have tools and services that fits all needs. So if you would like to talk to a sales representative about your needs, please let us know and we'll follow up with you after the presentation. So we'll just leave it there, Shane. We got a couple of questions here that I think are really good. Yeah, one is from Nancy, who has plants in US, Canada, and Mexico, so is fully USMCA, and manufactures garbage trucks. Interesting. So the trucks are made in each country, but shares components constantly, which is, you know, typical of the auto industry. And there's a debate on if garbage trucks are automobiles. Well, that is a really interesting one. Wow. And yeah, you know what? I don't know the answer to the question off the top of my head, but you know, it brings up a really interesting thing, right, Shane? Because there's all these sort of edge cases. Like, what about school buses? What about, you know, cement trucks? Or what about construction vehicles? What about, you know, I don't know. I guess it's going to be based on the product codes and all the individual components that are going into them. You know, it just highlights how incredibly complex it is.
Yeah, and I will say too on that, we were speaking with one of our partners the other day, and they are a large scale broker and international expert, and we were asking what the trends that they're seeing, and ironically enough, it's questions like this where they are seeing a boom in terms of their attorneys based upon consulting of understanding these country of origin. How do you decipher probably this? What is declares an automobile versus a garbage truck in these pieces? Just because of there could be significant implications on decision making there.
Yeah, another question here from Michael. What tool handles trade restrictions management? Well, we have a couple of, well, there's a few actually, ways you can access our trade restrictions content. You know, again, if you are interested in that, let us know and we can talk about, or we can help you get set up with whatever you need for your particular business. Okay, so JP is asking, it seems like the odds are low of the August 1st deadline moving again, but what if it does? How much farther can the administration feasibly push this out? Well, I would have thought they were going to push it this far, because remember, originally it was going to be 90 deals in 90 days or something like that, right? I think, honestly, I think the can's going to continue to get kicked down the road. I think that we're going to be talking about tariff changes well into the fall, to be honest with you. And I guess we got time for one last question. We gotta wrap up here. So, do we get charged base rate plus percentage of the HS code, e.g., 10% base plus? No, you get charged in the UK example. You get charged the 10%, but remember, there's Section 301, there's Section 232. Those ones could still apply. So some of it's still stackable. That's why you need to know your HS codes and your countries of origin, because then we can tell you exactly what your duty rate obligations are going to be. Okay, so sorry, folks, we are out of time. I do apologize that we didn't get to all the questions. You can stay up to date with all of our content. You can keep learning about what we have and all the latest tariff news through all these links here. Do not worry that you can't click on your webinar screen. You will get a copy of this after, and these will be hot links that you can click on, and you can get access to our trade content. So I'll turn it back over to you, Regina.
All right, thank you so much. Just a reminder that we have some upcoming webinars. You can check them all out at Avalara/webinars. And one last thing before we leave you today, just quick reminder that you will receive an email later today, and it will have a link back to the console where you can access the recording, the slide deck, and the additional resources. The email is also going to contain information or instructions on how you can register for upcoming sessions. August will be up shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And hopefully you'll join us next week as we continue our weekly webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. That concludes our webinar.